So, Rob, you're here today to talk about Camus, The Plague, and La Peste, his novel, which has started getting a whole pile of critical attention recently and has been it's been reissued recently by Penguin. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, if we could maybe start with some of the basics for people who don't know, could we perhaps maybe start with sort of an outline of the plot first, and maybe talk a little bit about the characters or the core characters?
Yes, of course. The plot's straightforward, Patrick. It's an account of a group of individuals in the Algerian city of Oran, sometime in the 1940s. A specific year is not given by the narrator. And it traces the story of this group, the way they meet, and the effort they undertake to resist a plague that settles on the city of Oran. And it's told from different perspectives. The narrator, who turns out to be the protagonist, he's the doctor by the name of Rie, uses various documents, including the notes being taken by one of his colleagues. They create sanitation teams. And so one of his colleagues on the sanitation team has left notes. There's a journalist by the name of Rambert, whose account is also incorporated into the narrative. And so the narrator uses these accounts as well as his own account in order to tell this story of what he calls ordinary heroism. And it is, to a degree, modeled on the account that Thucydides gives in his History of the Peloponnesian Wars. Among the books that Camus was reading during the occupation, as he was taking notes for the writing of The Plague, was Thucydides. And it's remarkable the ways in which he incorporates not just the chronological stages employed by Thucydides in his account of the plague that sweeps through Athens in 430, 429 BCE, but also he adopts the very tone of Thucydides. The tone is Hippocratic. It is diagnostic. It is neutral. It is in some way objective.
So okay, thank you. That's fantastic. It's interesting, right? I mean, Mary Beard, the classicist, the British classicist, right, who I'm sure you're aware of, she's basically a rock star over here.
She's amazing.
Yeah, she recently wrote a brief piece on not so much Camus, but on the idea of the literary pandemic, I suppose. And her point, she said, was that all literature begins with infection. Now, I think she was referring specifically to the Iliad, but I mean, you mentioned Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. So I'm wondering, in what sense, could you maybe sort of fill out that account a bit? In what sense is the plague consonant with the great sort of literary pandemics? And in what sense is it perhaps a deviation? I'm thinking here of maybe Thomas Mann or Gabriel Garcia Marquez and so forth.
Yes, of course. Camus prided himself on his love for things Greek, ancient Greece. And so he does turn to Thucydides. It's almost a reflex on his part. What's interesting, since you raised the question of the Iliad, is he doesn't turn to Homer. And of course, the account on the beach outside of Troy, that is the setting for the first book of the Iliad, as the Achaean army is being decimated by this plague sent by the gods, is kind of interesting. I think why he turns to Thucydides and not to Homer is that he doesn't want this to be a lyrical or a poetic account. He wants it to be as dry, as diagnostic as possible. And at a certain point, the narrator explains, as Thucydides does in his account of the plague, of the way in which he's going to approach it. And here, Camus is channeling Thucydides, Patrick, whereas Camus did not want his narrator, Rieu, to be seen or heard by the reader as channeling Homer. There's nothing epic about this struggle.
Right. Right. So that makes sense. And of course, if he's in the tradition of the Greek tragedy, I guess, is also in evidence in Camus' La Peste, or the Plague, because, and I think this is probably a theme germane to your own work, but I mean, what's the cardinal sin in sort of Greek tragedy? It's hubris, right? The transgression,
Yes.
the transgression of limits, and in some sense, the good and the resilience and the courage and all of the virtues that all the protagonists in the Plague do it's all quite modest. This is not sort of grandiose. They try to do good in very small, incremental ways where possible.
Exactly. They do that. Before we talk about Camus' understanding of the good, this notion of the tragic in Camus, it's very much there. And I think here too, he shares a good deal with Thucydides in the sense that the tragic in the history of the Peloponnesian Wars is that there's something intrinsic for Thucydides to human nature that will lead an individual, for example, Alcibiades, to fall, or will lead a city, Athens, to fall as well. It is this mixture of blindness and hubris that we see in those accounts of Athens' rise, and the very reasons for its success are also the reasons for its ultimate defeat at the hands of Sparta. Likewise with Alcibiades and his own career. But that's not the only aspect, I think, of the tragic in Thucydides. There's also the tragic in the sense that at the end of the day, we'll fail, we will fall, that there is no lasting solution. There is no lasting resolution or answer. And this is the point that I believe Camus is trying to underscore in The Plague. If you go to the very conclusion of the novel, Rieu is reflecting on what this experience has meant. This is when it's at this point that the plague has lifted, that people are, as we are now saying, restarting their economies, restarting their society. And his only thought is that the plague abides, that it is a temporary victory. There will be other plagues. And this is profoundly Thucydidean. This is profoundly tragic in the ancient Greek sense. And that's what I find most important in the tragic nature of both Camus' thought and Thucydides' thought. And I must, full disclosure, I'm neither a classicist nor a philosopher. I'm a modern French historian. But nevertheless, I think a case can be made for this.
Right. That's brilliant on the background. I'm wondering, would it be worth talking a little bit about the more sort of, some of the more practical issues that were impinging of themselves upon Camus at the time? I mean, it would be, I think, telling if you could maybe sort of recount what was the genesis of the book for Camus, what was the time he was writing, what was the context, where was he writing, when was he writing?
Yes, of course. He began taking notes for The Plague in the 1940s. He had completed by 1942, when he finds himself in France, and we need to keep in mind that he is French-Algerian. His native country is, as he always emphasized, Algeria, not France. And by 1942, he's a 30-something who had just completed the novel and the essay that will give him critical success, namely The Stranger and the Myth of Sisyphus. They're published under the occupation by Gallimard, France's most prestigious publishing house. And they win widespread admiration, including from Jean-Paul Sartre. And Camus was in Oran, as a matter of fact, which was where his wife's family lived. They were living in another apartment owned by his in-laws because he didn't have a job. The newspaper for which he had been working had been shut down by the authorities, and he was at that time tutoring Jewish children in Oran who could no longer go to the public school because of the anti-Semitic legislation that had been passed by Vichy 2 years before. He has to give that up, though, in the summer of 1942, because he has a new occurrence of his tuberculosis. He discovered he had tuberculosis when he was still at lycée, and in 1942, his doctor discovered that it had moved from one lung to the other lung as well. And he is strongly urged by his doctor to go to France to take a cure. And so he leaves for southern France in the summer of 42, and he rents a room in a farmhouse in a hamlet just outside of the town Chambon-sur-Lignon in southeastern France, which is in the Cevennes, which is a mountain range in that area. In November of 42, while he's living in Le Panelier, the hamlet by Chambon, the Allies invade North Africa. And as a consequence, the Germans, which until then had occupied only the northern half of France, invested the rest of the country in order to protect the Mediterranean flank. And at that point, as he writes in his journal, Camus feels trapped like a rat. He cannot return to Algeria. And it's at that very same time that he begins taking notes for his second cycle of works, a cycle that he would baptize the cycle of revolt. The first cycle that comprehends the stranger, the myth of Sisyphus, and the play Caligula was called the cycle of the absurd. And so he begins taking notes. And he reads Thucydides, he reads Daniel Defoe, he's reading Michel de Montaigne's essays. And of course, Montaigne himself had to deal with a plague in Bordeaux when he was the mayor in 1585. And so he has these sources. And perhaps even more important than having recourse to these sources, he has recourse to his experience. By the end of 1942, Patrick, he realizes that, as he writes in his journal once again, absurdity teaches nothing. He had to move beyond the absurd and that first cycle. And it's at that very same moment that he begins the writing of The Plague that he himself enters the resistance. He eventually becomes editor of one of the most important clandestine resistance papers, Combat. And in 44, with the liberation of Paris, he emerges as the poster child. He was very handsome. He likened himself to Humphrey Bogart, the poster child of the French resistance, as well as French existentialism. So that's the immediate background.
So that does, well, there's a lot there. So firstly, that strikes me as it's wonderful. Thank you, Rob. It strikes me then that there's something very personal going on, first and foremost, in terms of how I respond to what you say, because he's got tuberculosis. And of course, in the novel, the way the plague affects the primary symptoms of the way it affects the denizens of Oran is pulmonary. It's a pulmonary infection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, that's very perceptive. And he himself, ever since his late teens, feels as if, and rightly so, he is waiting for the other shoe to drop. He's living as if he doesn't know when it's going to end. He's
on borrowed time.
Exactly, on borrowed time. That was the phrase I was looking for. Exactly. And that sentiment, of course, permeates not just, for example, the myth of Sisyphus, but it's there in the Rebel as well as in the Plague as well. You're quite right in that.
So the other point that I wanted to respond to you about your characterization of the genesis and background of the Plague is this move from the initial cycle of novels, so Sisyphus, The Outsider, and sorry, what was the last one?
Caligula.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the absurd, and he says the absurd doesn't teach you anything. So in some sense, the plague is a type of self-criticism in a sense, or a form of self-reflection, where he's trying to go, okay, well, we have absurdity. Now, what do we do, or what is the kind of the moral response to that? And in some sense, it's revolt or it's resistance, right? Is that fair?
No, that's more than fair. That's spot on. This is exactly what he's doing at this point in his life, in his career. That what Camus understands by the absurd is not that there's something out there, an entity, something identifiable and has an independent kind of existence that we can label. That's the absurd. Instead, what Camus understands by the absurd is the convergence of two factors. The first factor is what the way he frames it or phrases it in The Outsider, the tender indifference of the world. It simply remains silent. And it remains silent, and this is the second factor, despite our insistence upon meaning. We seek meaning, we turn to the world, but the world doesn't respond. It doesn't reply. And this is what, for Camus, makes for the absurd. And one of the reasons why he never identified himself as an existentialist, Patrick, is because, to his mind, existentialists were more or less willing, at least at that point. Sartre moves on in 1945 with his public talk, Existentialism is a Humanism. But at that point, existentialism, as it was forming, was more or less content with acknowledging the state of affairs, but not in a way responding to it. And it's at this point, especially under the occupation, that Camus understands response is essential. In fact, it is in the response, the rebellion, the refusal to accept it, and instead the insistence upon resisting, that we find meaning. In The Rebel, he has this, I guess it can be dismissed as a glib tweaking of Descartes' cogito sum. But for Camus, rather than I think, therefore I am, it is I resist, therefore we are. It's in the act of individual resistance that we turn to the left, we turn to the right, and we discover we're not alone, that this is a collective enterprise. This was his experience with the resistance, that there were countless acts of individuals who, from 1940 on, said, no, I will not accept this absurd situation. And they begin to respond in various ways. He joins this resistance, this saying no in 1942. And in that resistance, he finds meaning. Now, it may not be as meaningful as others would want, but for Camus, this is about as good as it gets in our quest for meaning.
That's really interesting. In that little formulation you did there, I revolt, therefore we are. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. There is a kind of a repudiation of Descartes there, I think. It's
absolutely.
The meaning is found in the we rather than the I, which is the direct opposite of Descartes. That question that I want to ask you now in response to that is, and I'm going to try out my interpretation of it. Is Camus' The Plague is very famously an allegory, or it's seen as taken as an allegory of fascist occupation or Nazi occupation and collaboration and all of these issues. I wonder, well, firstly, do you think that is the case? My thinking is that in some ways probably more of an indirect allegory, in that it's more in terms of perhaps the atmosphere of the novel, that it's that we get the allegory rather than that the plague represents fascism per se, which I think, if you correct me if I'm wrong, that was de Beauvoir's critique of Camus. There was the plague was kind of an ahistorical view of fascism. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and he was hammered on this by a number of critics, not just de Beauvoir after the war, but also by Roland Barthes. who wrote a famous critique of the plague, in which, a bit like Beauvoir, but not quite like Beauvoir, Barthes suggested that Camus was making a category mistake of sorts, namely that he was associating what the French at the time called la peste brune, the brown plague, namely the Nazis, which was an all too human plague, with something that wasn't at all human, namely something that was virological. And Camus, in his response, told Barthes, and this was an exchange, I think, in Les Temps Modernes, the monthly review of Sartre and Beauvoir. And Camus explained that it was, in fact, you used the word allegory. This too is Camus' word. He says it is an allegory. It refers not just to the experience of France under the Nazi occupation, but it refers to other forms of occupation or the shadow of such occupations. And after the war, what's on his mind is not so much the experience under the Nazis, but the coming experience under communism. He was very much on the left. In fact, a bit like Simone Weil, he was an anarcho-syndicalist. He was far more sympathetic to the anarchists than he was to traditional socialists. And he was appalled by the communists in France and elsewhere. He belonged to the Communist Party in Algeria for 2 years in the mid-1930s and then was kicked out because he couldn't toe the line. And so he's thinking not just of the form of totalitarianism embodied by the Nazis, but also the form of totalitarianism embodied by post-war communism. But he also sees it in psychological terms, as you've suggested, as well as in philosophical terms. And this is where I think the notion of the allegory is most important. It is what takes place in Oran, takes place in all of our lives. Right now, the world, or at least those who have the luxury of thinking about it, Patrick, most of us don't. And Camus would be thinking about them right now. Those who are unemployed, those who are trying to keep a roof over their heads and keep their families healthy. But for those of us who can spend a moment and think about this philosophically and psychologically, most definitely, Camus was thinking in these terms too, that at the end of the day, there has to be a human response to this sense of occupation, this void, this refusal of the world to give us meaning. We have to carve it out ourselves. And he sees this in collective action, just as collective action is the answer to socioeconomic ills. It's also the answer to, I guess we could call, psychophilosophical ills. Now, having said that, not only am I not a philosopher, but neither was Camus. He was very clear about this. He wrote 2 philosophical essays, The Myth of Sisyphus and then The Revolt, which was published in 1952. And
not bad, those.
No, not bad. And he majored in philosophy at the University of Algiers. But his work was on Neoplatonism. In fact, it was mostly on Augustine and his Confessions. And he didn't have Greek, he didn't have Latin. And as Sartre rightly remarked, Camus was something of a dabbler when it came to philosophy. And so these are all things that we need to keep in mind when we think about these works.
That's interesting. That sort of sense of collective resistance. That's one of the things that struck me in the novel. Just before I go on to sort of the list of questions I want to ask you, so I could probably talk about this all night, but there's a very particular moment in the novel where you have, I think it's Rue, and I think Panaloo is there. It's the moment I'm referring to, Rob, is when the child dies, and it's Rambert there and is Theroux there.
No, it's Panaloo, and it's after they undertake that experiment with that new cure on the child, who the son of the local magistrate Othon, and it fails, and the child, after hideous tortured pain, dies. The the Catholic priest, Panelu, tries to explain it, and Rieu refuses these explanations.
Yes, and they have a kind of a vigil. So the child, they try out the new serum, and the child rallies, and he falls back, and he rallies, and ultimately he passes away. And in some sense, it's quite beautiful because Rieu and Panelu, they have a kind of a moment of solidarity, which kind of transcends their, Rieu's secular humanism and the priest's Catholicism, and then they kind of revert back to their, I'll say, gentle antagonism, I suppose.
Yes, it's true. And it's, in a way, what Camus is basically, it's a reprise of this lifelong debate he was having both with himself about the question of God, the question of faith, as well as with those Catholic priests to whom he was actually quite close, beginning in the Resistance. There are commentators who believe that Father Panelu's married on Father Bruckberger, who was a Dominican priest in the Resistance. And it may well have been that Camus was having similar discussions with Panelu. But there's also an echo of Dostoevsky and from the brothers Karamazov and the Grand Inquisitor, which also deeply impressed Camus. In fact, Dostoevsky was always one of his touchstones, and along with Kafka, I should add, and Nietzsche. And basically, what he is telling Panelu is, I refuse, as Ivan Karamazov tells his brother Alyosha, I refuse to buy this ticket. I'm returning the ticket to this world made by this God. He might well exist, but I want no part of it. And this is the very argument being made by Rieu in that give and take between him and Panelu. And yeah, I think, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. That's great. I just thought it was an interesting, because it's not a judgmental book, or he's not judgmental of the characters. I mean, he's quietly critical of the Panelu character, but in some sense, while they're caring, in the act of caring for this child, they do have a kind of an ersatz solidarity, I guess, for want of a better word, which I thought was that's where the revolt is, I guess. That's what he's trying to pinpoint.
Exactly. Yes. And there's a dynamic, both in Camus' life as well as in this novel, between solidarity and solitude. These are, in a way, the two poles of our existence. So consider the fact that, as you rightly note, there are these moments of solidarity between Panelu and Rieu. And it's not just while they are holding this vigil together over that young boy, but it's also the fact that Panelu joins the sanitation team, and he's there helping every day with the task at hand. Remember, early on in the novel, Rieu more or less boils down his ethic to, we need to do our work. We need to do the job to which we're assigned. And he understands this, and Panelu understands this. And the job at that moment is to combat the plague. And so there are these moments of solidarity, but there are also moments of solitude. Think, for example, about the way in which Panelu dies. He dies alone with his face towards the wall and his back turned to Tahu and Rieu when they enter his room. And you have, in the case of Panelu, you have him facing away from his friends, alone, holding the cross and facing the wall. And in a similar fashion, at the end of the novel, Rieu is alone as well. His wife has died. She has gone to France to take a cure, just as Camus has. Camus survived. His wife, his fictional wife in the novel, doesn't. And so he's effectively alone as well. And so he ends the novel alone after this sustained exercise in solidarity with the rest of the sanitation team. They go their separate ways. And this is something that Camus himself was sort of ricocheting between his entire life, these moments of solitude and moments of solidarity.
Now, one of the other things I'd like to ask you about Well, when I reread it recently, one of the things that struck me, I read it when I was an undergraduate student, and profoundly impressed by it, and it was my favorite of Camus' books. And I didn't notice it at the time, which probably tells you something about me when I was 19 or 20. But when I reread it, I thought, there's not a lot of women in this. There's not a lot of women. Now, this is something I want to see what you think about, because in your autobiographies, one of the points that you say, we've got a couple of women in this. We've got Rieu's wife, who's pretty much quickly shipped off to the sanatorium at the start. Rather,
exactly.
She's dispatched with, right? So the lads can get on with sorting out the plague.
Mm-hmm.
But the other character is Rieu's mother, and she is characterized as mute, as silent. Now, when you write about this in your biographies, you say that this is a lot more significant. There's a lot more underlying this than meets the eye. So I was wondering, perhaps, could you speak to that, Rob?
Yeah, one of the layers, I think, and one of the superficial layers, is the fact that Rieu's mother is modeled on Camus' mother, who in fact was mostly mute. She had a vocabulary of about 400 words. And he returns to this silence time and again in his novels, in his journal, in his essays, especially the lyrical essays that he wrote in the 1930s. And finally, and most heartbreakingly, in the unfinished novel, The First Man, the one he was writing when he died in the car crash in January of 1960. He is consumed by his mother's silence, by her inability to read the works that he's written. And it's not just the mother's silence. In The First Man, which is profoundly autobiographical, he writes about the silence of his home growing up. His grandmother was illiterate, as was his mother, and the uncle who lived in the same household. They were all illiterate. The uncle was also mute and had a vocabulary of about 100 words. And so time again, in The First Man, the protagonist, Jacques Comrie, speaks about this silence. And so this silence, which was all too real, all too palpable, all too, in a way, physical for Camus, also takes on, and I guess this is the deeper level, Patrick, takes on a philosophical significance. In a way, the silence of his household, of his immediate family, in some way channels or distills the silence of the cosmos, the silence of the world. His quest for love, his quest for meaning is never met in that home. Just as a philosophical being, it's never met when we look to the skies and ask for a reason or ask for a response. And so this is at play with Rieu. You're right. The wife is packed off, which is very convenient, and the mother is reduced to silence. But this may well be what love is at the end of the day. It doesn't speak, but yet it's there. This is something that Camus insists upon in The First Man. He knows his mother loves him, but it is a love that in some way either beggars or is simply too great for language. So this is very much at play in his life. His effort to interpret the silence. And in some really odd ways, and more practical ways, he does serve as an interpreter. For example, in The First Man, he talks about going to the cinema with his grandmother, who couldn't read, and everything was in subtitles because they were silent movies that they would sometimes see. And so she would ask Camus to read to him what was being said on the screen. And he had to utter the words. And it always placed him in an awkward position because others sitting in the audience would hush him. And so while he was trying to communicate to his grandmother, he's being prevented by others. And anyway, that's not a here nor there, but
no, it's interesting.
Yes, silence is a great preoccupation for Camus.
What is it in the silence? Is it like, is there kind of a dignity, or the silence, in the same way that the plague, it reveals what's important and what's of value? Or is it where we can begin to, get rid of all the sort of the idle talk and chatter and sort of needless, trivial, banal sounds that sort of fill up modern life?
It's all of that, but it's also more. I mean, silence, of course, is charged with possible meanings, not just one meaning. For Camus, silence can mean resignation, submission, that of workers who are forced to labor long hours for inadequate wages, people who live in a state of precarity from one day to the next and do not have the words to give voice to the injustices and inequities that they confront on a daily basis. And this is one of the reasons why he was so taken by the thought of Simone Weil when he discovers her works after the Second World War. But silence can also be the mark of resistance, as it was quite often in France. One of the great clandestine works written during the resistance was Vercors' The Silence of the Sea, in which a German officer is barracked with an uncle and his niece on a farm. And their response to the German officer, who's very cultured, very civilized, and very talkative, is silence. They will not talk with him. And Vercors is proposing this as an answer. This is one way in which we can resist, by refusing to engage our occupiers. And so it can be a mark of resistance. So there can be a dignity, a nobility, one that, for example, this German officer recognizes by the end of this novella. But what's most important, I think, for my understanding of Camus, Patrick, is that be it submission, be it resistance, silence is the signal for somebody who can speak, the writer, for example, to give those without voices their voices. Camus underscores this point in his Nobel Prize address in 1957 in Stockholm, where he gave a conference following the speech, as a matter of fact, and it's called The Artist in His Time. And he talks about the artist has two obligations, both to art as well as using that art to those in need, those who cannot speak. And time and again, he refers to these individuals as les muets, the speechless ones, the mute ones.
Within that, then, I guess, again, the act, the urge to speak, to say, to give voice to the voiceless, there's something kind of almost biblical about that, because there's also the sense that one can attribute blame, right? And, blame and accusation, recrimination. This is happening at the time Camus alive. This is the time of who's collaborating, who is not collaborating, right? So do you think all of that is part of the background to this, or is underlying this notion of silence?
I think it is. What's interesting about judgment, which is one of the issues you've just raised.
Precisely, yeah.
And with the liberation of France, or the liberation of Paris in 1944, Camus, who was always opposed to the death penalty, broke with that right after the war.
That's right, yeah.
Made the case that for collaborators, the death penalty was necessary. And for a number of reasons, and it would take too long to describe them, he reconsiders this position and realizes he was wrong. And there's a famous exchange between Camus and the French novelist and profound Catholic François Mauriac, who was also deeply conservative. They were so unalike in so many ways. But Mauriac and Camus did share one thing. They were both in the resistance. And Mauriac argued that this was a time for forgiveness after the war, Because what was taking place in France after the liberation of Paris and other cities were these hideous scenes of women being shaved bald because they were deemed horizontal collaborators, having slept with Nazis or with German soldiers. And there were countless instances of popular justice of those who had been deemed collaborators being shot or hanged by local groups of resistance fighters, many of whom joined the resistance at the 11th hour. And Camus realizes that Mauriac had a point, that the resistance, or those who resisted, had become in a way as bad as those they were now punishing. And this is so important, Patrick, for an understanding of Camus. And this is the essential thesis to The Rebel, as well as to The Plague, is the distinction he makes between revolt on the one hand and revolution on the other. When you resist, when you rebel, you remain cognizant of the humanity of those against whom you're rebelling. Revolutionaries overlook shared humanity, and they're willing to treat those that they resist and then perhaps defeat just as they had been treated by their oppressors when the oppressors were in power. Both sides refused to recognize what Simone Weil, in her essay on the Iliad, the poem of force, talks about, namely force. We're all subject to it. And Camus recognizes this after the war, and he admits to Mauriac in an exchange, you were right and I was wrong. And he returns to his anti-death penalty stance, and he basically washes his hands of the purge that followed the country's liberation. And so he learns that how difficult it is at times like these to render judgment, and at times how important it is perhaps to maintain a kind of silence before speaking, before rendering such a judgment.
And this is, of course, this feeds directly into the famous spat he had with Jean-Paul Sartre.
Right.
Now, one of the things I'd like to talk to you about, when you're an undergraduate, or the sort of the way this is taught at undergraduate level, is that it's existentialism, it's about individualism, and you can ultimately it's about self-assertion, and it's about self-creation and self-invention, and you have to kind of repudiate existing and prevailing forms of ethics. Now, one of the things in your work that you try to draw out about, particularly with reference to The Plague, is the types of ethics or the type of ethical discourse that Camus is trying to articulate. And there is a kind of an alternative ethics, or a kind of an ethics of resistance that emerge in the novel, and they seem to coalesce around different themes. Now, we've talked about some of them already. We've talked about silence and moderation, but some of the other things you talk about are fidelity and attention, I think. But I'm wondering then, I'm going to give you, I suppose, what would an American say, a softball question? Is that right? Did I get that right? So it's like, is there why are there no ethics in existentialism and in The Plague, Rob?
Why are there no ethics?
Yes, that's the softball question.
No, that's not a softball question. That's the curve. It's a curveball.
Question.
Which is just the opposite.
Oh, I get it. Yeah, God. You should see me talking about cricket. You should see me talking about it even worse. Yeah.
That will require not 15 minutes to explain to me, Patrick, but 15 days at the very least, which is the length of a cricket match, right?
I was about to say.
Yeah. Again, novels are not where one tells. Instead, it's where one shows. And first and foremost, Camus is a novelist. He's not a philosopher. He's not making an argument. He's making a story. And even the story that he makes with The Plague, to my mind, tends to be overly didactic. At times, he sins against that precept about showing and telling. And he does tell us. At times, Rieu and Tartu are basically lecturing the reader about what is and isn't right, how one goes about one's job, how one doesn't go about it. There is an ethics there. It's just not perhaps as either clear or, certainly for professional philosophers, coherent enough to be recognized as a philosophical case for a certain ethic. And this is one of the reasons why Camus always insisted that the myth of Sisyphus and the rebel were not works of philosophy. Instead, they were les essais philosophiques. They were philosophical essays. And here, once again, we need to think of Montaigne, one of his guiding lights, that an essay, by definition, is a trial. It's a groping towards. And this is what he sees himself doing in these essays. And of course, what he's doing in his novels as well. And if there is a system to be taken from these works, the essays and the novels, great. But I don't think that's what Camus saw himself or saw himself as doing.
I think that's absolutely right. If we think of, like, say, someone like Plato, the philosophers, as my literary friends always tell me, the trouble with philosophers and literature, we come along with our big sort of arguments and go, this is an argument about, justice, this is an argument about truth and so on like that. But, even Plato was more nuanced than that. The arguments are in there, but they're also couched and furnished in sort of literary representation and play and symbol and allegory and all the rest of it. Yeah, and that's what makes it richer, I would say. And that's why, Camus is more fascinating, because he works at the intersection of literature and philosophy and history.
No, I agree. And, one of Camus' great fans, Iris Murdoch, you see somebody who, in fact, embodies those at times competing, imperatives between being a philosopher and being a novelist. And those novels that are most successful in Murdoch's oeuvre are those that are truly novelistic. But at other times, she is making a philosophical argument. And I think the novels in those cases suffer as a consequence. So absolutely, there are two different ways of conceiving the world and our role in the world.
And as well, in addition to that, Rob, yes, certainly there are passages in The Plague that are quite didactic. There's a sense of the moraliser in it, although you make a distinction about that, which we could talk about. But also, what I found when I reread it was, some of it is beautifully written. You said at the outset that, it's not lyrical, it's not the epic, but there's a very lyrical and poetic quality to the prose, at least, would you say?
At certain parts, he allows himself to be lyrical. For example, there's the scene in which Tarrou and Rieu, they go back to Rieu's apartment, and then Rieu says, I believe it's Rieu who says, let's take time off for friendship. And they go for a prohibited swim in the sea. And that moment is just so ravishing, Patrick.
That's beautiful.
This is where, Camus is sort of allowing himself to be the younger Camus, the lyrical Camus. And this comes out again, for example, in The First Man. He could be extraordinarily lyrical, but I find that those passages that are lyrical in The Plague are so effective, in part because they're fairly rare in The Plague, unlike The First Man, unlike The Fall, unlike a number of his short stories. The Outsider is a case apart.
Okay. So one of the other questions, and this is slightly to the side, but in your books about Camus, and I'm going to try and sort of bring things to a close now over the next few questions. But one thing, and I think would be interesting for British listeners as well, is that on a number of occasions in your biographies of Camus, you draw an analogy with Orwell, right? Or you say that they have a similar spirit, and I can understand why. Orwell, the great leftist who's critical of the left, who's critical of totalitarianism. Is that simply it, or do you think there's more to it? Do you see other parallels between Orwell and Camus?
I think that there's also, and I think I make mention of this in the Harvard book on Camus, is their love of nature, their love of the everyday, their attachment to the physical world. It doesn't sound right when you say it about Orwell, but there was something of the sensualist to Orwell.
Oh, for sure.
And his essay on the common toad, for example, is gorgeous. And this is something that
shooting an elephant,
Camus,
probably.
or shooting an elephant, exactly. These are just Burmese days.
Yeah, great stuff, yeah.
It's amazing stuff. And this is also deeply Camusian, this attachment to the world. And there's also the fact that the two of them were journalists before they became writers. And I think that as journalists, they learned their writing, or at least the writing of Camus that we see in The Outsider and that we see in The Plague, is it's been, the lyricism has been domesticated by the need to communicate as quickly and as directly as possible. Yeah. And so we see the same absence of lyricism in some of Orwell's pieces, like The Road to Wigan Pear, that we see in the works of Camus that we've been talking about. But I think it's really the spirit of independence.
Yeah. It's probably a sense of... Sorry, Rob. Yeah. Probably a sense of absurdity as well. I mean, Orwell was shot in the neck, I think, so that's going to give you a sense of contingency of life. Yeah.
Right, and he was tubercular, as Camus was, of course, and they both were chain smokers. I mean, you can. I think Camus was a much better dancer than Orwell.
Yeah. So. There's definitely a comparative PhD in there for a enterprising grad student.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I got two questions left that I'd like to ask you. One of the things that you make, one of the important distinctions that you make in your work when you're describing Camus, you say there's a distinction between Camus being a moraliser and a moralist, right? Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, that leads me on to the last question. What would Camus, do you think, be telling us now in this time of pandemic, this time of pox and plague, right? As a moralist, not a moraliser, what do you think he would be telling us right now?
Well, the distinction between moraliser and moralist is not mine. It was Tony Judd's, who wrote a striking essay on Camus, in which he makes this very distinction. And what Judd meant was that a moraliser is somebody, well, like me. I'm always wagging my finger at my kids or at my students, telling them that they should be doing this and not doing that, right? Somebody who hands out lessons left and right to others, but doesn't really apply them to themselves. A moralist is somebody who makes not just others uneasy, like the biblical prophets, but also makes themselves uneasy, according to Judd. You can think about it in terms of being scrupulous. I believe that the word comes from the Latin, where you have a pebble lodged between two of your toes, and it makes walking a bit painful. You're aware that you're trying to walk and you can't quite do it. There's something bothering you. And this is where we get the notion of scrupulous, that we know we should be doing something, but something is wrong with us, and it prevents us from doing it smoothly. And this is what Judd understands by a moralist. Camus was always uneasy with himself. He was never at home with himself. He often denied that he was a guide, that he was as confused, as lost as those who increasingly in the 1950s sought him out for advice or guidance. That's what makes him a moralist and not a moraliser, though he was often a moraliser. There's no clear distinction in his life at times. Now, as a moralist and not as a moraliser, what would Camus have to say to us today? I have no great insights. I wish I were in a position to channel Camus right now. I often ask myself, this is a question I've asked myself, over the course of decades, what would Camus do when I find myself in certain situations?
So you must smoke a lot, yeah?
Well, I quit about 20 years ago, so that's no longer an option for me. And I'm a terrible dancer, and I don't look like Humphrey Bogart. And the problem, Patrick, is that I never really know what he would do. Instead, in terms of what we're confronting today, what he would tell us is what Rieu tells either himself or his fellow sanitation team workers in Oran during the plague, namely that we have to ascertain the facts and then speak them and act upon them without fear of political authorities who may disagree. That we have to, as Rieu does time and again, and it's such a pat phrase nowadays, but it becomes less pat when you actually find yourself in such situations. Namely, we have to speak truth to power. This is what Camus saw himself doing time and again. And he was mostly right in doing this. And at times where he could no longer speak truth because he was being willfully misunderstood by all sides. For example, during the war for independence in Algeria in the 1950s, he retreated into silence. He could no longer speak and make an impact, he thought. And so we search out the facts, we act upon those facts, and we insist on speaking those facts and those truths to others, to those in power, and representing those facts on the part of those who are powerless. I guess it comes down to that.
So from now on, it can be said that the plague was the concern of all of us, as one of the quotes from the...
Exactly, or what he tells Rambert, the journalist who wants to get back to Paris, and his girlfriend. And Rambert keeps insisting, my place isn't here in Oran. And Rieu replies, yes, it is.
Yes, it is. I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you, Rob. That was fantastic.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I really enjoyed it.